Please pray with me. Holy and gracious God, send us your Spirit. Move, speak. Open our hearts to listen. We want to know your voice, your message this day. We pray in your Son's name. Amen. Our gospel lesson from Mark this morning is one of those depends on your mood texts. On the one hand, the rich young man in the text has not come off all that well, and his wealth and desire to keep holding on to that wealth is the reason why. As citizens and residents of the richest country in the world, well, that maybe barbs just a little. We might find an excuse to set that barb aside, to say, no, that's not us. But if we're honest, we know that we're probably implicated at least a little bit in this message about the rich young man. On the other hand, stewardship is coming up in just a few weeks, and a text that reminds us to look closely about our relationship with wealth and God, well, that's like free candy. It's not a curse as a pastor to have that kind of text before stewardship, because stewardship drives have been built on far, far less. So it might surprise you that I don't want to look at either of those two as a sermon focus. At least not to start with. But don't worry, we'll come back to that challenge. It's there in the text, and we have to address it. But I want to start with a simple line. A line that, far from challenging us, maybe gives us hope and promise to face those challenges in the text. A line that, as far as I can tell, and I looked last night, is unique to Mark's version of this story, but in my opinion changes the whole tenor of the conversation. It's this: Jesus looked at him and loved him. It's so short, it's so simple, and yet I find it to be powerful, because it affects the entire way that Jesus interacts with this young man. We have a young man who confidently asserts that he's followed all the commandments his entire life, which of course, because he's human, is not true. He clearly hasn't. None of us can do that. And it's possible to look at him with skepticism or even derision. After all, here's a young man who's offered the chance to walk with Jesus and goes away weeping instead. Hardly a role model to give to our kids for our faith. And yet Jesus looked at him and loved him. To me, that colors the entire interaction. Jesus in the beginning is not just quizzing a young man to see where he understands about God's ways, but is trying to teach, trying to show, because he loves him. Jesus does not see someone bragging about how good they are, but someone whose possessions are holding them back from true and fuller faithfulness. And importantly, Jesus sees someone capable of being a disciple, someone that Jesus wants to walk with him. He looks at him, and he loves him. It's out of that love, out of that care, out of that seed potential, that the challenge comes to this man. Go, sell your possessions, and follow me. Because possessions for this young man were holding him back, were keeping him from being who he could be for God, for the gospel. That this rich young man is unable, at least in the text, to embrace this challenge, this opportunity, is almost immaterial. The challenge comes from love that Jesus has for him, and the desire for him to be fully who God made him to be. Why does it matter? Because that same love is there for us, as is the challenge. Make no mistake, the challenge is real. As I said, we live in the richest country in the world, perhaps even, I don't know all the stats, but I would not think it's untrue, perhaps the richest country in the entire history of the world. Even those who are poor in this country have so much more than the poor around the world, and most of us in this room don't qualify as poor. Whether we want to admit it or not, we are the rich young man. We have many possessions we care about. We have wealth beyond most of the world's imagining. And if it's difficult for that rich young man to enter the kingdom, that's us. And we need to take these words to heart, to listen to their challenge. I say with confidence that if this passage doesn't cause you and I to squirm at least a little bit, then we need to read it again. Because it's there. Now, having said all of this, I want to let you know that the wealth is the side issue in this story. After all, Jesus had followers who were landless and poor, and also followers who had wealth, means. Followers, like many of the women in Luke's gospel, who shared generously from the resources and wealth and food. Followers like two of the first disciples, who owned their own boat, who hired staff. Remember, in that first call, two of the disciples left their father and their boat and the hired hands. Wealth is not the problem, and money is not evil. Alas, there goes the sewage angle. No, what this text tells us about is that which we cling to and that which clings to us. That which keeps us from faithfulness. It is about what gets in the way of us and the ways of God. What gets in the way of us and the fuller relationship with God that we're invited into. It's about those stumbling blocks that we put in front of ourselves, that we allow to have space that ought to be reserved for God. And far too often that is indeed our money, our possessions, our wealth. Far too often we are indeed like the rich young man. The thought of letting go of our stuff is hard. It makes us weep. Yeah, still leaves the rest of us. Wealth by itself is not evil, and money has no moral value alone, but we cannot and should not ignore the fact that it can be a stumbling block for us. It just can be. And so often it is. And we should hear this text, hear the challenge of that in this text, and pause, think about the ways this is true or not. Our own lives. But yes, there are other stumbling blocks possible. Our hobbies, our leisure time, even maybe our families. All good things come from God, but sometimes we allow those good things to keep us from God, and that's what Jesus is talking about in this story. When we allow those good gifts to keep us from being whom God calls us to be. This message calls upon us to watch for that, to strive to do otherwise, to strive to keep our priorities straight, with God first and everything else second. And that's the challenge, and it is not an easy challenge, make no mistake. But here's the hope. He looked at him and loved him. Jesus looks at us and loves us just as we are, loves us even now as we struggle with those stumbling blocks, even now as we struggle to find our priorities. For Jesus loved the rich young man even before he gave up that wealth, even before he walked away sad. Jesus looks at us and loves us. And through that love, through that grace, nothing is impossible. For nothing is impossible with God. Not the rich man's salvation, not people who are rich getting into heaven, not us finding ways to let go of those things that cling to us and keep us from God. Nothing is impossible, and God's love empowers us, though we may need to be willing to turn around. That's my headcanon for the young man, by the way. The Bible doesn't tell us what happens to him. It merely says he walked away sad. But in my head, I imagine him meeting Jesus, hearing this challenge, and yes, mourning it. It's a weighty challenge, and we shouldn't fault him too much for weeping. But eventually, in my imagination, he turns around. He returns to Jesus and says yes, and then does what Jesus instructs him to do. Sells his possessions, becomes a disciple, becomes a follower of Jesus. For nothing is impossible with God. Now that's made up because we don't know. But the hope for us, well, that's very true. We will have moments in which we mourn the cost of discipleship. We might have moments when we find ourselves not yet ready to say yes to something that we're called to do by Jesus. We will probably have times when the things of this world do cling tightly. They're hard to let go of. That's part of being human, after all, in a sinful, fallen world. And yet, by the power of Jesus' love, by the grace of God, we can do it. We can move past all that keeps us from God. We can find the ways to be who Jesus calls us to be. We can find the strength to let go of all that keeps us from God. We can find the ability to repent. That's another way of saying turn around. We walk instead of the path laid out for us by Jesus. To once again follow where he leads. For Jesus looks at us just as we are and loves us. Now, tomorrow, and every day. This is one of these stories. It challenges us, it confuses us, it hopefully makes us think and examine ourselves. But even as we do all of that, we remember the one other thing this passage offers us. A reminder, an empowering reminder of the love of God. Jesus looked at him and loved him. Loves us. Thanks be to God.